Good afternoon and welcome to, this is either, it depends on how you count the General Synod Recap. If the General Synod Recap is our first program of next year, then this is the last Reformed Church Center program of the year. If not, then this is just the next to the last Reformed Church Center program of the year, but certainly a warm-up for the coming General Synod. It was just under a year ago this time when the workbook for the 2023 General Synod came out, and some of us amazingly actually read through the thing from cover to cover, sometimes because it's our jobs, that I got to read the report of the African American Black Council and read about how they were claiming that the church order includes racist elements in it. And I will tell you that my first response as a white heterosexual male who grew up in the Reformed Church was to be indignant. And that lasted for about a minute. And then I thought, wait a minute, if there was racism in the church order, I'd be the last one to see it. So then I wanted to find out more. And so that was a helpful prompt for a conversation that's going to be going on, I suspect, for some time back and forth in the church as we figure out just what that means and what to do about it. And so I approached Sharon Atkins, the president of the AABC, and said, so who can we get to come and have a conversation with the Reformed Church Center about this so that we can start the conversation outside of just writing things in the workbook and sticking them in places where nobody ever reads them. Earl James is the person whom Sharon Atkins said should be the one speaking on this. So Earl, if you want to know who to blame for getting you into this, you can call Sharon. I've tried talking to Sharon about things like this and you don't win, so it's going to be fine. Earl is the retired coordinator for the African American Black Council of the RCA, as well as the retired coordinator for Advocacy in the RCA, and currently serves as president of the African American Black Council. He has assisted RCA African American congregations and people and others as well to find and walk pathways to living more fully into the biblical vision of shalom and human hope of the beloved community. And so is now doing all of this in retirement. And I won't tell you where he's doing it from today because you might just be too jealous to listen to the program, but he might. Matthew van Maastricht is pastor of the Altamont and Helderberg, New York Reformed Church congregations and is an adjunct instructor in RCA studies here at NBTS, where he teaches standards and RCA polity. He's also a doctoral candidate studying Reformed polity at the Theologische Universiteit Utrecht. Now he's no longer in Amsterdam, and that's because he was traded. There's a whole deal with that. Get him a beer sometime, he'll tell you the story. And he's a founding leader of the Society for Protestant Church Polity. In his spare time, he serves as general editor for the Congregational History series of the Historical Series of the RCA, and raises a very active young child who is coming out remarkably well-adjusted despite having a father who reads Dutch theology and polity, and does lots of other good stuff in his classes and synod. So we are glad to have both of them here, and Earl's going to begin, but both of them are going to really be in more of a conversation than a presentation response mode today. Earl?
Thank you, James. It is certainly an honor and a privilege for me to serve here with Matthew in this conversation and with you, James, on behalf of the Reformed Church Center and the RCA generally. Just one piece, James asked Sharon Atkins who should speak because Sharon is our chairperson, and Sharon pointed at me, for whatever her reasons were, as the vice chair of that. And if you know Sharon, I am here to serve her. So what I want to start off doing is to talk a little bit about our constituency, the people of African descent who are members of the African American Black Council, and to describe a process that we went through in order to make our recommendations to GSC, and then to share a bit about what GSC did with our recommendation, and then what's next. So that will be the flow of this part of our conversation. First thing I want to say is that there's a variety of awarenesses that many of us who are AABC or African American Black Council constituents have about being in a white denomination or a Dutch American denomination. Some of us have been here all of our lives. You know, the RCA has been the one denomination that has been our home. Others of us are new, perhaps new over the last 5, 10, 15 years. I'm one of that group. I'm new to the denomination. And there's others of us who are still trying to find our place to some degree or other. But let me say this about all of that. Those of us who have been here all of our lives, in the main, not everybody, but in the main, we have both adapted and adopted what it means to be part of our RCA. Others of us who are new have also adapted and adopted to what it means to be part of our RCA. Still, others of us have adapted to, but have not fully adopted what it means to join this family. Part of the reason for not adopting as one's own is related to this kind of a matter. Before we came here, the Lord did many things with us. The Holy Spirit guided many things of us. The Holy Spirit blessed much of the work that we have been doing, that we had seen happen. If joining means that we have to turn our backs on that, whether it is a real request or an assumed request, that we somehow have to lay that to rest in order to fully adapt as our own what it means to join. Well, a lot of us will adapt, but not necessarily to adopt. And that's an important dynamic to keep in mind. What it points to is typical stuff about diverse groups of people. Are you part of an in-group, part of an out-group? Are you part of a group that is like me, or are you part of the group that is not like me? That in-group, out-group, like me, not me piece is not particular to the RCA. It is particular to wherever there are diverse groups of people. It is not particular either to issues of race or ethnicity. It's also relative to gender, to generation, to the part of the country you may be from a disability status, your sexual orientation, any number of places. This in-group, out-group, like me, not like me piece can be a very powerful dynamic. But today we're talking about race and racism. So this is the dynamic that we're in the mix with today. So to get at this, the AABC's executive committee decided we need to listen to our constituents. We need to speak to people about their experiences of what it has been to be part of this RCA family. Everyone, we believe, wants to feel the RCA as being home, their home for them. How has that being home worked its way through many of us? Keep in mind, we had a variety of responses. Some of us have felt this is just fully our home. We don't see any racial ethnic divides. Others of us felt there are divides, but we've been able to both adapt and adopt. And others of us felt like, yes, there are divides. We've been able to adapt, but not adopt so well. Altogether, we identified 56 specific experiences that our constituents had that are categorizable in terms of in-group, out-group ones, where they were part of the out-group. For a few of us, as we tried to get our heads around this, we found Howard Thurman's model that he talks about in his book, Jesus and the Disinherited, to be particularly helpful. Thurman was trying to draw parallels in that book between how Jews of Jesus's time dealt with the Romans and how people of color, parts of the global majority in our time, deal with adapting to white power. He was saying it just isn't something by itself. It's in relation to a particular thing, either the real or perceived threat that the majority has towards the minority, with regards to what it feels like to be safe, what it feels like to be part of, what it feels like to be fully affirmed to be parts of. And we found Thurman's model to be particularly helpful. Thurman talked about, in this case, kind of two basic responses, one of non-resistance, the other of resistance. The non-resistance has two pieces to it. One is imitation. The response of imitation would say that in order to, in the face of real or perceived threat, to be as safe as possible for self and for others like me, I need to adapt and adopt as my own that which the majority group has. If they see that I am just like them in many, many ways, then the level of real or perceived threat should moderate, should lessen, and we should be safe and secure. That's imitation. The second non-resistance group was this. It had to do with reducing contact with the in-power group in ways that preserved the opportunity to express through one's own cultural, religious heritages, etc., in a way that kept you safe. So it would be akin to saying, if you know what the emperor needs, give the emperor his due. Give the majority group what they need to have from us. You own that for yourself, and you give that. Hoping, expecting that that is enough so that they will not have eyes on the rest of what you do. And that rest of what you do can just simply reflect who you are, what makes you feel most at home, what is uniquely yours, what you don't have to give up in order to be part of. So those are the two non-resistant pieces that Thurman put forward. Thurman kind of said the first piece, the imitation piece, was like the Sadducees. The second piece was more like the Pharisees. I think for those of us who are much more theologically adept and historically adept on that point than I could argue back and forth with Thurman's point of view on that, but that's what he thought. The second area was resistance. Again, the resistance is to secure for oneself and one's group a sense of safety and peace from perceived or real threats. Now, Thurman admitted that the non-resistant pieces were actually also resistant pieces. You chose one of those strategies to safeguard other things. Okay. But in addition to that, he thought that resistance could be overt, it could be mental, could be emotional kinds of attitudes, positionings, stances that you take going forward. It could express itself as a desire to sort of isolate as much as possible and be off by yourself. Perhaps, Thurman said, as the Essenes. Or it could be the way Thurman described it, like the Zealots. This is untenable, and we have to overthrow this and create a new order. Some of the 56 reported experiences that we heard are addressable through the 2022 General Synod adopted anti-racism policy. I want to hold up the elements of that policy that led us to think more systemically about these stories that we were hearing. Specifically, I want to hold up just 3 or 4 parts of it. The first part, in the policy, it identifies a 2009 General Synod statement that declared that racism is a sin because it is an offense to God. And it was saying that the sin of racism can be expressed as a policy, it can be expressed as a behavior and or a belief against a person or people that is based on their identification and or membership in a particular racial or ethnic group that is considered a minority. A second part of that definition, well, that part dealt with what is racism. The second part dealt with what is anti-racism. And it says that anti-racism is the practice of confronting and changing policies, behaviors, and belief that perpetuate racist ideas and actions. I want to hold up just a third piece of that, not the whole statement in there, but the idea that racist actions and behaviors have religious outflows, they have social outflows, cultural outflows, economic, political outflows, so on and so forth. But any of this range of outflows can deprive many of us of the right to develop our own personal and corporate identities. And when you think about adapting, that's where that piece comes into play. How do you own into, where do you find the right to develop our personal and corporate identities? And the last piece of that policy I want to hold up is the sixth part of it. And it says that we are committed to dismantling racism in its attitude and its structures in all assemblies. So to sort of summarize and add to some of this, racism can be overt, it can be covert. Racism can be intended, it can be unintended. Racism can be a macroaggression. Racism can equally be a microaggression. Let me say this also about those 56 experiences. Some of these experiences were personal. People would say things like, I did, and this is what happened to me, that kind of thing. It was very personal. Still others expressed their experience as interpersonal, that something took place between them as an individual and one or more other individuals. Still other people described their experiences through a cultural and or systemic lens, or perhaps we might say a theocultural or theosystemic lens, if such expressions can serve us. It is these cultural or systemic ones that the AABC focused on in its report to GSC. The denomination has in place a variety of ways of people coming together to address our personal and our interpersonal things, but maybe not as many to address the cultural or the systemic challenges that we face. So that's the area that our report focused on. Part of our contention was a belief that any polity that was based primarily on the experience of one racial ethnic group and to which other racial ethnic groups had to join and ascribe to without bringing their own views to the table is inherently racist. Now, we're not saying that this is something where people are intended to be battered. We are saying that, irregardless of all of that, the tendency to have a polity structured around the thoughts, the beliefs, the practices of a particular group that others must conform to means that it's very hard to develop your own personal and corporate identities when you have to adapt and adopt someone else's. We saw that as a historic fact. It's a historic fact because it sets those of us who are from outside the denomination who come in and join us for a variety of reasons. With an in-group, out-group dynamic, it sets us up to a like me, not like me dynamic, an adapt-adopt dynamic. So we concluded that aspects of the BCO and aspects of our anti-racism policy are at odds with each other. We believed that those odds should be identified and, if and when possible, resolved. So, for its 2023 report to GSC, or the General Synod Council, the AABC made the case for a study to be completed that assesses the BCO, that looks at the BCO against the anti-racism policy, and that the BCO be brought into alignment with the policy. In response to that, the GSC asked all the racial ethnic councils to make such an analysis through their constituents' experiences and to make specific recommendations. So in response to that, the AABC's executive committee interviewed a number of our constituents. We asked for stories. We didn't ask them for parts of the BCO. We asked for their stories. We asked for their experiences. And certainly some had none to report initially because They've adapted and adopted. They did not see the BCO as having any racist piece to it. Others of us did see it that way. And I would say some, after we got back with them about some of the things we were hearing, had more things to say because they had not thought about this dynamic in this way. So we shared the 56 specific instances that they shared with us with GSC. Then we shared using the format required of us by General Synod Council. We used and identified 7 specific areas of the BCO that our experience suggested were allowed for because they were violations of the anti-racism policy. In addition to those 7 specific areas, we identified 3 additional areas that amounted to projects which, if completed, could result in further BCO changes. We put those 2 categories of recommendations into 2 reports and forwarded them to GSC on December 31st of 2023. You get the sense there's a back and forth going on between GSC and the AABC on this. That is the case. In response to our reports, the GSC formed a committee to review and advise it on any next steps that committee would recommend. So at its March 2024 meeting, GSC received their committee's recommendations and adopted 5 of the specific recommendations that we made, and will in turn recommend those for adoption by the 2024 General Synod. Let me just give you a brief overview of those 5 areas. First was to place language in the BCO's preamble about the full diversity of the body of Christ relative to race, ethnicity, color, gender, and economics. The second was to place language in the BCO article and section on the responsibility of classes. To the extent that it is possible, the ministry of classes should reflect the racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic diversity within the bounds of classes. Typically, we found and felt that the ministry of classes represented the diversity within the classes' churches, the socioeconomic diversity within the classes' churches. We were saying that the bounds of classes is not our churches, it's a geography, it's a geographic thing. Why should not racial ethnic considerations be leveled at that level? So that's one thing that's going forward. The third thing points to all of our confessions, including the Belfar. Currently, the BCO says that only it is the Heidelberg that will be expounded upon during our worship services. We made a recommendation that that would not be enough for our racial ethnic purposes. So GSC agreed with our idea and is going to put forward a piece that says in our worship, all 4 of the confessions should be expounded on. Well, the 4th and the 5th pieces dealt with ministers of word and sacrament and commissioned pastors. And they said that classes needed to ensure that all of its commissioned pastors and all of its ministers who are actively serving in its jurisdiction are adequately trained to serve fruitfully in urban, suburban, rural, and or tribal areas to which they are called to serve and are assigned. What our feeling was there is that each of those areas has a profound impact on the everyday life of our membership. That to have a pastorate that is not aware of, numb to, ignorant of, not responsive to these day-to-day challenges that we get faced with and how they are different in urban settings, suburban, rural, and tribal areas. The Word of God has much more penetrating power than what we are giving to it. So we wanted our pastors to know where they're at and to have a good sense of the everyday life challenges our people face and be able to speak from the pulpit and to define ministries and prayer and outreach that can address all of that. So that was another piece that we recommended specifically for the BCO. The other part that I mentioned that we made recommendations to were not specifically addressable to the BCO, but we recommended that the GSC form a committee that could review and make recommendations about some other anti-racism steps that we could take. There were 3 of those. I just want to break down what those 3 are for all of us. The first area dealt with what's called best practices. Best practices are oftentimes thought of not as a step-by-step that a person or a group takes. They're not they're not requirements about what you have to do in what sequence, but rather they are guides, they are tips, they are pieces of advice that have been tried and tested in certain areas that can lead to certain desired results. We felt that perhaps far and away, the one institution in the RCA that has made the most progress towards being anti-racist and is still making more progress towards being anti-racist is the New Brunswick Theological Seminary. So we talked with some of their leaders. What did they learn? And out of those learnings, what were some best practices that they could identify? And we had a good, healthy discussion around that piece. We thought that there were a few best practices on how to assess your own organization's, your own assembly's readiness to become more anti-racist. We took a look at and identified a few measures that could be put into place to help you move in the direction of becoming more anti-racist. And we had some evaluative best practices that could be helpful to saying, this is the work that we've done. How do we know that it's getting us where we want to go? This is not set up to somehow clone New Brunswick Seminary, but it is set up so that if a classis or a consistory or any assembly or group of people in our denomination adopted 2 or 5 or 10 of these things, they would have sort of footprints to follow down the pathway towards becoming more anti-racist. That's the goal that we had for that. The second deals with the confessions. We talked a little bit before about all 4 of the confessions with regards to worship. Well, we also thought that of our 4 confessions, really the Belhar is the only one that directly talks about race and racism. It is the only one that gives theological and practical advice on how we go, where do we go from here to eliminate racism in our midst. The other 3 were written long before racism became an active, studied, legalized approach to keeping people separate and a way of exerting superiority of one person group over another. So the other 3 confessions do not deal with racism. But what all of the confessions do, and they do it in concert with each other, is they talk about how do we, as members of the body of Christ, how can we live together? How do we treat ourselves and each other? What does it mean for us to be just and fair and holy towards each other? And our recommendation would be for some group of people to look at all those confessions, identify these just and holy, righteous ways we should be connecting together, and to build bridges between them and anti-racism. And that at some point to recommend to a wider RCA how these bridges can help us, certainly with anti-racism, but also with a much wider spectrum of our togetherness. Because as I said at the top of my part of this presentation, there are lots of things that just cause in-group and out-group, like me, not like me. Yes, in our denomination, but across many of the other areas of our everyday lives. This issue could equip us to address all of that. And finally, the third thing we recommended was developing and using what we're calling a racial equity lens that could help us ensure that decisions and actions do not have race-based power imbalances embedded in them. Let me say something about that. Um, Many of our constituents and constituents of other councils, as well as people who are white or people based on gender or people based on generation, but we're talking now about race, can surface stories where either they felt outnumbered and therefore shut down, or felt they were not heard, or felt that such and such happened, I got hurt and wounded, and nobody thought to ask me about this. And for whatever reasons, didn't surface. Well, in Matthew 18, Jesus gave us some direction as to how we can solve our challenges with each other without having to resort to going to, say, civil court. Matthew 18 is a very, very sound and solid way forward. Christ blessed it. But there is a piece in that that impedes our ability to be Matthew 18ites with each other, and that deals with the issue of power. When the power dynamic is that one of the groups has significantly more power than the other, how do we ensure that that decision was right and just and fair? And how do we assure that the person who is decided against is not carrying with them a wound that is unexpressed, unaddressed, and unhealed? How do we do that? So we thought that if the denomination developed whatever a racial equity lens might be, to develop a racial equity lens, and where there is a statement that such a decision or action that was made hurt or disregarded or discounted, or this is how I felt, not just from this one decision, but this group has left me feeling this way over time. This lens could then be applied. And it could be, whether it's a formatted process like a decision tree, or whether it's a group of people who have some special training for how to listen and how to ferret out power issues as resulting from race. They could apply that, and that they can make recommendations. They could say, in our estimation, there really is not a race-based power dynamic here. Or there might be, and this is a way to address that, or there is, and here's some ways to address that. We did not see the racial equity lens as having decision-making authority, but simply having the authority to flag that there's something here that our Matthew 18 pieces may miss going forward. Our issue is not so much who wins or which side is identifying the right way to go. Our issue is, how do we maintain ourselves as the body of Christ, where all of us know that each other knows we all belong together, that we're all part of that. Well, that's where we are. GSC is going to make has some more work that it's going to do with regards to those 3 extra BCO recommendations that we made. And that it will present to the 2024 General Synod those 5 specific areas about BCO alterations that may go forward. Well, that's the part of my sharing with you about what our process was, why our process was taken, and some of the results of our process up to this point. I'd just like to sort of ask you, Matthew, as my conversation partner in this, what do you have to say about the anti-racism policy and its own, so to speak, dance with the BCO? What are your thoughts about the AABC's processes and how we tried to go about this, and your thoughts about the GSC's next steps? Any part of the things that I shared with you, I'd love to hear your reactions to them.
Well, thank you very much, Earl. I appreciate your work in this and your sharing of this. I want to be clear as well that I have neither the desire nor the intention to try to rebut anything that Earl has shared or anything that the AABC has been working on whatsoever. And so I just want to be clear about that. One of the things I think is important to remember with this is that the church order did not fall from heaven complete with an orange binding. The church order is itself a result of a historical progression, as it finds itself contextualized in the different contexts it finds itself in. We saw a big example of this of when the church order of Dort of 1619 is sometimes held up as like the pinnacle of Reformed order, but really it's just the last and an arrested development of church orders. It had been developing after 1619. There were no more synods allowed to be called, and so that development kind of stopped there. So when the Reformed Church was forming its constitution, it adopted the Articles of the Synod of Dort as its church order, but also adopted explanatory articles. Those explanatory articles help to apply that church order in the new context in which we found it, because even though it's still it has a European root, right? It still mostly kind of comes from a European cultural context. The realities in the Netherlands, especially in the early 17th century, and the realities in the new United States of America were quite different. And so those needed some adjustments. And so I think it's important to understand as well the fact that the church order is necessarily an evolving document, an evolving reality, something which is always responding to cultural context and cultural realities. And so, as such, I think the process that the AABC went through with the other racial ethnic councils as well are really good, really important, and really things that are that we should have been doing quite a while ago as we look forward together. The Reformed Church has long been a multiracial denomination, and most of the people here today can attest to that reality. However, it's only been more recently that we've been self-consciously so. And so I think that what we have before us then is the challenge and an opportunity to how can we take this self-consciousness of a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multicultural denomination, and how do we have it reflected in our in the constitutional way in which we exist, in the very essence of our being. The Constitution, of course, consists of three legs, but the general American way is we like a constitution that functions as a law. So we have the church order, which has kind of been the de facto, the Constitution, the thing that holds us together. And I think that when we rely on a law to hold us together, I think that becomes very problematic in a lot of ways. And so what I think this also allows us for is how do we back away from this particular framework is the thing that holds us together, to allowing for other cultural backgrounds to be able to see themselves in how we do our work together. Because we see this throughout history as well, and across context, is that the church is both at home and not at home in every culture. And so every kind of cultural background should be able to see something of themselves in it, and every cultural background should be able to see something which is not doesn't sit completely right, because the gospel always pushes us a little bit toward something better. And so I think this opens up a very good, very ripe opportunity for further development and growth if we are able to actually take this invitation and handle it seriously, which takes time, it takes effort, it takes a lot of discussion, a lot of openness, and it takes back and forth to try to work through this. I think the recommendations that are coming for some of the changes are certainly good first steps, But I think it's important that these steps don't seem like these are the only steps that are taken, as though these are first steps toward something, because I think the realities to which you bear witness are ones that we need to take seriously and we need to work towards, so that it is a denomination at which everyone can find a place that can be their home, rather than simply moving into an already furnished house, living with other people's things. How does everyone take some of their own things and move into the house to kind of make it everyone's shared together?
Thanks for that, Matthew. It raises several questions for me. I'll try to be really crisp with my questions. Our denomination is extremely diverse. I kind of think of it as deliciously diverse. Okay, it's lots of wonderful things in the mix. Yes, we are from different continents. We are from different nations and different ethnic groups, and we all want to be home here. But each of our groups has its own multi-generational / intergenerational challenges, whether it's with the African American Council or the Council on Pacific and Asian American folks, or the Hispanic Council, or the Native American ministries, or the Dutch people, the Dutch American people who are part of the RCA. We have intergenerational differences with regards to governance, with regards to ways forward. You made quite a case that we are self-conscious about our diversity, and you made quite a statement for the fact that our BCO has been an evolving document that reflects our evolving realities. Do you think that this identifying a way forward, how do you assess this? Should we start from scratch and just say, look, we're a different group than we were 60 years ago. Start from scratch. Let's build from the ground up. What are your thoughts about that? What are your thoughts about this? We have something in place. It's something we're working on improving, enhancing as we go along. Let's continue the process of improving and enhancing that. Would you just talk about those two possible ways forward?
Yeah, thanks. It's a really good question, and a really big question as well. I like the term, I like to think in images, so I'm going to keep with the building image that I used. Is that in a lot of ways, what we have right now is we have a particular cultural expression of a Reformed tradition that came over here from Europe, and we kind of built a house with it. And as things have changed, we've kind of added other rooms, other apartments. We've expanded that building. I think so there's two ways that you can approach that when the building seems to no longer be sufficiently adequate for one's needs or serving one's purposes. One is that you can, continue modifying it. You can continue remodeling it, renovating it. Well, there's three things really. That's one, is continual renovation. Two is you can level it and you can build something completely new with all completely new stuff. So throw a wrecking ball through it, haul all the materials to the dump, and then start over from the ground up. The other one is to dismantle, right? So you can take the building apart, and then what you can do is you can take the pieces that are still good and that are still important and still meaningful. You can keep pieces that are rotten or that no longer kind of serve the intended purpose. They can the necessary purpose. They can be Some of those can be tossed, but those pieces can be incorporated into a new building, which was the case of building, and I think, the community where I am was built a lot in the 19th century. And so that's what was popular with building. Building materials were more expensive, more rare. And so it was more common to dismantle a building and build something new with those pieces. I think the idea of sending a wrecking ball through it and hauling it all off to the dump and starting new, I think that in a lot of ways, I think that's unfaithful, because it gets rid of all of the work, all of the kind of the journey of our forebears. Also, I don't know that kind of keeping the kind of the building as it is and keep renovating and remodeling it piece by piece as needs arise. A leak springs here, or there's a water seeping over there, or something like that is the best way to go about it either. I think if we want to really embrace the opportunity, and this is a huge challenge, because the whole time I've been a minister as a denomination, we haven't been able really to think with the front of our brains. We've all been acting a lot from the brainstem and haven't been able to think with the front of our brains very much and take a minute and really work through this. If we really want to seize the opportunity, I think what the opportunity presents us with is what in our kind of our ecclesiological understanding of church, what is that trans-contextual ness that I think the Reformed tradition brings that can speak beyond contexts? What are those things which are more contextually rooted? What are those things then which are more essential? What are those things which are more optional? And we can work and we can take this, and I think the opportunity then for us is we could build a new denomination with beginning kind of with the parts of what exists, but we can build a house for all of us, in a way in which we can all kind of see ourselves. Now, that's risky. It's hard. It would require a lot of commitment. It would require a lot of give from people like myself, particularly of Dutch extraction, who have kind of been around kind of this, for whom this is kind of the expression that is comfortable. And it would involve kind of a lot of kind of a fair amount of sacrifice in some of those things. But I do think that the opportunity that we could gain from this, to kind of recontextualize a reformed way of being church in the United States, I think the gains that could be given for us, for the world, could far exceed those losses that some of us in different ways, that many of us in different ways will experience, if we want to take it seriously.
Thank you. It raises another set of questions that I'll try to speak to a little bit. It's a question of timing. It's a question of how does leadership leadership in particular, tend to decide whether it is the right time to do a profound change, an incremental change, what have you. I think that's an important question, because if a decision is taken to do it now and it is premature, then there certainly is not a sufficient amount of focus and energy and collaboration building, et cetera, at the table to have us go forward. It may simply be premature, and we may lose some things in the process. Likewise, waiting too long in order to initiate a radical or an incremental change can also have its downside. The energy for it could have evaporated. Other things will come up to the table and will take its place as being a critical thing going forward. Now, over the last, I would say, 30, 35 years of my professional life, there was a particular theory of change that I found really helpful. It has a very technical name for it. It's called the simple theory of change. And it only really has three parts to it. The first part is you do an assessment of the status quo. Are there a sufficient number of people who are there and ready for a particular change? If there are not, change is probably that's not the right time. If there are, then it may be the right time. So it's about that. The second part deals with, do we have a shared preferred idea about where we're going to? If it's not both shared and preferred to what it is now, then we don't really have a way forward. It's got to be both. But then there's a relationship between the desire for change in the status quo and the shared preferred future, right? If it's all desire to change but no way forward, that's like saying there's all heat but no light, all right? If there is not a whole lot of energy to change, but we have this great idea that we're all behind, there's a lot of light, but there's no heat. There's got to be this relationship between the two, and it's in that relationship that the third option, what's the plan? What are we driving for? That comes across. As I think about this topic with this theory of change, I think now is a good time for creating significant change in how we understand our togetherness, how we find a place at this table for whatever group wants to belong. Whoever needs to feel this is home, I feel like we're at a good time right now for making that kind of decision.
Indeed. Yeah. Thank you for that. And I think the work that has been done so far has allowed for both some heat and some light into what we're moving for, as well as some energy. And I think and so I think it's it's great kind of groundwork that has been laid for this. So thank you very much for the hard and difficult work and meaningful work, important work that you have put in toward this end.
But just to keep in mind that this was a joint effort, the AABC was involved in this. The General Synod Council had a huge amount of oversight, overview of this process. They had their own process independent of ours as to what to do with what we recommended. I see this as an organic piece that is growing out of what it means for us together to be part of the RCA.
It seems like we're at the place where we're ready to open up the floor and invite others into the conversation. So I remind everybody that you find that reaction button down at the bottom of your screen and click on that, and then you'll see raise hand. And if you raise your hand, I will be able to call on you in the order that you show up, because I have a nice little list. Oh, and it's already starting to happen. But I have one ahead of that person who's already gotten in. And this came in the Q&A while Matthew and Earl were still talking. Somebody who's chosen to remain anonymous writes, RCA history has been that of not a multiracial denomination historically since its early Dutch founders, and remained as a close-knit cultural-based group. This, of course, based in North America outside of our missionary work done overseas. Not until the early 70s, the RCA started showing signs of reaching out to other cultures, hence Spanish as thus being the largest minority, second to the colored race. Any responses you all want to give to that?
Yeah, I don't know that much about the history of the RCA prior to that. I do know that in the early 60s, I believe, there was a commission on racism that met for 5 years. They did a lot of very serious study with regards to our denomination. Their notes, their meeting minutes, their communications about what is possible and what are we finding, those are all available in the archives. I know that in 1957, the RCA made a substantial statement with regards to what its multiracial future could look like. What I think both of those things were about was a lot of light, but not much heat, to use that theory of change piece, because not a whole lot grew out of it. Where I think the commenter, where I think we're on the same page, is it was in the late 60s, early 70s, when the racial ethnic councils first started to come on board. That was catalyzed by an event that the African American, that became the Black Council, sort of took over the RCA offices in the Riverside Drive office, and made a statement about our need to be part of the table. It wasn't just setting some money aside to do some mission work. It was having a place at the table for vote, for expression, for not just to have a voice, but to be able to have our hand on the rudder as well. So our council came around first, and then subsequently the Hispanic Council and CPAM and the Native American Ministries came on board. So I agree with the questioner that for much of our time, we were not very focused on that. But in 57, we had a clear thing. In 60, we had a clear piece. But where the internal heat to make a difference started to build came in the mid 60s with what became the Black Council and subsequently the other councils.
And if I may kind of add on to that as well, is I certainly have no desire to kind of make the RCA seem like a multiracial paradise or anything like that. Its origin was certainly white. For a long history, it was very majority white. However, I think that, and Earl, you were getting at this too, is that it was a while back now that we were no longer solely a white denomination. Now, we weren't self-consciously so, especially in areas in the East, in the cities in the East Coast, especially. A lot of the churches, as the neighborhoods change, the demographics of the neighborhoods changed, the demographics of the churches changed. So there were people of other races and ethnic backgrounds in the RCA, but we were not consciously a multiracial denomination. That came a little bit later, especially with the Black Manifesto, with the efforts to create the racial ethnic councils, and further since then. So when I say that we've kind of long been a multiracial denomination, I mean there have long been people of a variety of races in the RCA. But it has been like we're glad you're here in our house. And it wasn't until later they said, no, we want to also have a home in this house. We don't want to just kind of be visitors here. So so I agree with the questioner. I think it's all kind of how you how you parse some of those terms. But I think that's exactly right.
Yeah. I would point out, because this is something that we talk about extensively when we teach RCA history here at New Brunswick. There are a lot of the documents related to this that are part of an RCA Reader, which is a book in the historical series that's available on Amazon. If you put in an RCA Reader, it'll find that for you. And talks about things that have gone back. We talk about things that have gone back to the colonial period. Not always did we do it very well, but it was there. I want to get to some of the raised hands. John Norton, would you go ahead and unmute and share with us?
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yep.
My experience makes me ask the question, why do we always start when we're trying to mix cultures and races? Do we always start with the problems? I mean, I can remember my time in the Senate of New York when I spent a lot of time roaming around and going into this church and going into that church and then talking with this pastor and then talking with that pastor. And I would often ask, well, why are you here? And he said, well, because we like the Reformed Church. That's why we're here. And when I think back, maybe one of the most successful things that the Synod of New York did while I was with it was have bowling parties. And we asked pastors and elders to all come and go to these bowling parties. And then we would especially mix them up so that you had to say something. You couldn't just be there and be quiet. And I mean, I can tell all kinds of stories. Another one that pops into my mind, and this is one that I had 14 Korean pastors in my dining room. And, we talked about the church and what was going on. And I asked them, what do you really want from the Reformed Church? And it was a very simple answer. We want respect, and we want to find friends. Nobody talked about creeds, or nobody talked about whether you raise your hands in worship and wiggle your hips. Whenever I would go into white church and talk about raising your hands and wiggling your hips, they would say, "Isn't that cute? We'd like to experience that once, but we would never do that ourselves." Well, to me, that's really starting to dip into racism. Whether we could say that in a formal meeting, I doubt it. The other good thing that Synod of New York did was we had a Korean translator for every class meeting. And then what happened, or every Synod meeting. And what happened, we finally getting votes instead of non-voting from Koreans. It's that they had opinions, yes, but we had to make the effort to let them in. They wanted in. They wanted to be a part. And maybe that's where we have to begin. What is it that we love about each other that brings us together? And from that, we will hit all those snags. And but part of hitting a snag is not to go into it with a negative feeling, but we're going to find out whether worship is really the center of what makes the Synod exist, or if it isn't that, what is it? Maybe it's just people that do like to come and have votes about issues and the ability to stand up and talk and not be disrespected for doing so. Well, it's a long question, but the question to me is, can we start from the positive, what brings us together, rather than the negative, what divides us? That's my question.
I would like to take a crack at that. That was a very complex question. And John, I think you articulated the troubling part of it very well. As I said earlier in my presentation on our process, there are generally 4 spheres of operations: personal, interpersonal, cultural, and systemic. The AABC is a council. It operates within the sort of structure of the denomination. So it is going to tend to be much more cultural and systemically focused. What you did in the region was focus on the personal and the interpersonal. How do I get to know you? How do you get to know me? Do I want to know you? Do you want to know me? Am I afraid to get to know you, or reluctant because of real or perceived barriers in getting to know you, and vice versa? My observation, and this is not an AABC thing, this is an Earl James thing. It is a thing that predates by a long shot my becoming an RCA member. I think it is a human problem in that personal, interpersonal sphere. when it oftentimes comes to crossing these barriers, we are much more comfortable with spectator kinds of things than we are participant kinds of things. It's like with sports. We can be in the stands cheering on, but we're not going to be on the team with you doing X, Y, Z. Consequently, and this is probably an unfair statement, but when we have joint worship services, those are good things to have in and of themselves, but they only go but so far, because if it's my pattern that I'm the participant, you stay the spectator. You get to say I participated in one of their services. You may not understand what my wife says that we go to worship to take out the trash, among other reasons, because of all of the macro and micro things that build up on us in the course of the week. Part of what we need God for is to unburden us and to release us and to free us from the trash that has been piling up on us. Well, as a spectator, you don't enter into that. You get to observe it, but you don't enter into it as a participant. And I would suggest that many of the things that we do that are either personal or interpersonal, it lets us stay spectators. And it doesn't get thought of as to how do we break down the spectator piece and do the participant piece. You did something with bowling, and I imagine that there's lots of things, different ways this can be done. Well, I know that there are lots of ways this can be done. It's designed to move us very rapidly out of the spectator mode into how do I participate with you in your reality. I think that's a critical piece going forward. I would just say this to conclude this. I don't think it's an either or, personal, interpersonal versus cultural, systemic. I think it has to be a both and. I think either of them alone, either of those two groupings alone is insufficient to make the change. Hopefully, if they're all four of those spheres are functioning together, we can all go down this pathway together in a much better way.
And if it's okay if I kind of add to that as well, I think the problems can be a catalyst. The reason that Paul wrote his letters was because of problems. The reason that the Nicene Creed exists is because of problems. I mean, the reason that we have a New Testament canon is because of problems. The reason that the Protestant Reformation happened was because of problems. So I think problems can be a catalyst, and that can be a similar thing here. I think problems shouldn't, but simply solving a problem shouldn't necessarily be the goal. The goal should be something a little bit bigger. And so, kind of what you had said, John, is that you said, what do you want? Oh, we want respect, and we want friends. And I think in some ways, what we're talking about here is how do we find a way to show respect for others of a different racial, ethnic, cultural background? And how do we help to build friends, right? So that's some of that friend building that can happen at a local level. Respect can't be legislated, but I think but some of these things can help facilitate a space in which respect can be more clearly articulated as well. And so I think it's not only a matter, to go back to the building analogy, it's, the problem is, well, the roof is leaking, so let's fix the roof. Well, it could also be, well, the roof is leaking and there's some other things, so let's think more broadly about how we can make this better for everybody else, for all of us. More permanently. And so I think problems are an important catalyst. Without problems, nothing changes. But I think it's the vision that you have. Is it just to fix this one problem, or is it, oh wait, we can think a lot broader and end up with a much better result?
Hey, Mark Westerfield, would you go ahead and unmute and share?
Okay. Hello, James, Earl, and Matthew. It's good to be here, and it's good to hear from you. I'd like to share an experience, if you don't mind. I'm currently an elder in the Reformed Church, and I have been in the Second Reformed Church in Irvington. Irvington is somewhat of a mostly Caribbean community. There is also Puerto Ricans there. There are some from Ghana, from Nigeria. I have found, and I was, no one wanted to take that spot. I'm there 3 weeks out of 4. But I have found that by being very attentive, giving them my full attention, being as kind as can be, visiting them at hospitals, going to their funerals. I've also baptized and given communion, been given the permission to do those things as an elder. And we have developed a great rapport there. I've also discovered some things on the negative side of it. I found that those who have come in from the American South, African American from the South, I have to work a little harder to get them to trust me than those from the islands. And I also discovered that there is politics, even in a homogenous setting, that can be divisive. We do have some right-wing people there, and we have, of course, the other side of the coin. So it's tough for me to walk down the center and not get too heavily into politics. But I was surprised to see a conservative MAGA element amongst some Black people that I never thought I would see. So I'm learning some things. Irvington is right next to a natural dividing line of Springfield Avenue. On the one side is Maplewood, which is all white, and Irvington is, for the most part, all Black. So that's part of my experience there. Sometimes I hear from some people of color who say, you know, why are more Spanish people moving in here? Why do I have to learn Spanish now? Why can't they learn English? Which was exactly what white people have been saying for years. So this business of prejudice and bias is something we have to work on with everyone. Also, I just wanted to share this. I went to New York Theological Seminary, and they decided that they would give a scholarship out to those students who would go and do their supervised ministry in a culture that was opposite than their own. And so I went to the Bronx. I went to St. Stephen's United Methodist Church, which was all Black. And it was the most profound experience of my life. They were so accepting and so welcoming. And I had grown up being taught by my parents not to be racist and to be someone who embraces equality, but to actually live in a setting, be embedded somewhere where that needs to take place was a whole nother experience for me. We had people there in our Sunday school class that had just gotten out of Rikers Island because they put teenagers in Rikers Island as adults. So I was confronted with that. We also had some crime that went on that was confided in with me, and I had to kind of counsel through that. But while I was there, I can remember a pastor who once said to me, if you find yourself saying that I can't imagine doing anything else but this, you know you've been called. And those words came to me while I was there. I had never preached where people were saying, amen, call and response, where I would call out part of a scripture verse and they would feed me back the rest of it. They would walk one step, two step, one step, two step with the choir during the processional. The ushers always wore white gloves. It was just a different atmosphere, but one that I will cherish my whole life. And I felt so much like, hey, these are people with, you know, and I hate to say these people, like stereotype people, that's what has been done through the centuries. But I got to see that we all have the same problems. We all want to keep our kids away from drugs. We all want to see them get a great education. We all want to make sure that we can get them to make friends and networks that will help them advance their careers. So my suggestion is that New Brunswick Theological, as well as Western, would have these programs that will embed future pastors in churches that are cultures opposite of their own. I also think that later on, we can do the same as congregations. We can swap pastors. We can go and have dinners, maybe the kind of dinner that Jamaicans and Haitians prefer to eat, and invite them to come to one of those luncheons, share their music. I'm a drummer, so I know that I had to bring some congas and timbales and maybe steel drums to my church. And it's amazing what happens when you say, hey, I'm going to try and treat you to an experience that you're familiar with that can just set your spirit on fire, because I'm caring more about you than myself.
Gentlemen?
Well, thank you, Mark, for sharing as you did. In so many levels, I think you pointed out things in your part of Irvington that clearly are urban contexts, clearly are being challenged by realities in many urban communities that may not be expressed in the same way in suburban, rural, tribal areas. And I think that in the way you described it, it certainly said how those contexts affect how those everyday contexts affect the spiritual life of people, the kind of questions people ought to be surfacing and raising to our Lord, and how this should be part of their prayer life and their worship life, so that they could grow, as opposed to an approach to just says, we don't need to be aware of your environment so much. Beyond your personal experience, we shouldn't need to be aware of your geographic environment so much. I think you talked about some of the real nitty-gritty stuff that happens in urban change that may be specific to urban change. And I think if a pastor or an elder such as you were to go to a rural area, you would find a whole different set of things. And if you were to bring either a neutral or an urban perspective to that, you would miss hearing the heart and soul of people that are in the rural environment in terms of their challenges and changes. So I want to thank you for pointing out that there are some specifics that underscore ministry that we oftentimes do not think of, except that the people who are there may think of it because they have to live it. It's just they don't have necessarily that many places to register it with, or people who are saying, I am absolutely open to have you register this with me because I need this for my own life and development. So thank you.
Okay, John Chen, would you please go ahead and unmute and share? John, you have to unmute.
Reverend James and James Brown, I'm equally surprised of what I heard about, that there's something going on with the Book of Church Order. There's something that we need to take another look. I was just as surprised as you are. But listening to the two gentlemen, the dialogues, I am convinced there is something that we need to work on. And we are in the midst of restructuring, right? So I felt that maybe it's a good timing that we ask all interested parties, ask them to be part of this process to discuss, because I think there's a lot of validity that we go on. I hate to see this thing after you fix the two between the black and white issue, and then another yellow or purple people react, oh, I'm not included. So I think during this reconstruction period, I think we need to make them aware this is dismantling racism is not about black and white. It's about, even within the yellow group, my group, we have diversity within the yellow, the different shade of yellow. So I think to save time, and energy and human resources, I think it will be prudent if we invite all parties involved, all the churches involved, is let them know. Because when I saw this, I thought it's a black and white issue. It's not. It is a human issue, and we are all part of that. When I was first joined the RCA, I talked to a pastor. How come you don't share this book of church order with them? How come you do search committee? You don't use the search committee book. So, oh, those are for the white folks. We are immigrants. It doesn't belong to us. So I have to deal with this kind of nonsense. Excuse my language, but that is nonsense. Okay, that kind of generation is passed on, and they have not contributed. I hate to say that. They have not contributed to the process of making RCA a better place. I like to see that the next generation, and I'm very glad to see that RCA right now has some generational spark to help to rebuild the RCA. So if John Norton's listening, John, there are a lot of positive things going on. People don't say it. I'm going to say it. There are lots of positive things going on in the RCA, and Generation Spark is one of them. There's so many good things in there. Okay, so let's help each other, sharpen irons, continue this journey together during this reconstruction period.
Thank you, John, very much for that and for sharing your insights as well. I think you're exactly right. I think this could be a prime time to think about some of these things. The big challenge is that we always want to put a tight deadline on how things work. We want to redo everything, and we want to redo everything in 2 years. Unfortunately, things don't work quite like that, especially work like this. And so I think one of the things that we as the RCA would have to kind of deal or be okay with, rather, is the reality that these things take time. The people of God wandered in the desert for 40 years before they made it to where they were going. And so I'm not presuming that we should kind of take 40 years to get to anything, but I do think that that to do it and to do it well, it takes time. And yeah, you're exactly right to have all the voices. So it's not just a matter of Black folks and white folks, but it's a matter of the great diversity with which God has planted us in this context, in this denomination.
I appreciate that. And thanks a lot, John, for all the points that you raised. A couple of things that it reminded me of. First, the base of this discussion grew out of the Black-white question of what does it mean to be Black in the United States? And maybe secondarily in Canada. I'm not sure what the situation was like there and how that expressed itself there. But certainly in the United States, it's where it originated. However, today there are some realities that we need to deal with. Number one, many young adults are biracial or multiracial and claim that. They're less willing than people in my generation or perhaps your generation would say, I'm only going to pick one or the other. They would say, my parents were both, I'm going to honor that. So they bring that to the table, and they bring that idea of engaging with reality to the table. Another piece, you kind of touched on this, I think, was the idea of different generations. And not so much in the AABC, where most of our members grew up in the U.S. The CPAM and the Hispanic Council have many people who are first generation and whose first language is not American. It's important to understand that they have a generational challenge in this as well that affects this conversation. Because what does it mean to be acculturated to American or Canadian culture? They're second, third, fourth generation Asians or Latinos. are going to have a very different view of what does it mean to belong here than their first generation forebears or parents or grandparents. So those are things that have to be taken into account too, in terms of what does this all mean for us to be part of the RCA together, where the RCA is home for all of us. I think a third big change is back in my day when I was considerably younger, more Matthew's age perhaps, I don't know. We could function very easily with a single focused issue. These days, intersectionality is a big, massive way of thinking things. How does race and gender overlap? How does race and economics overlap? How does this and country of origin, how do these different pieces overlap together? And how do we determine what right relationships are, just relationships are in these intersectional zones? So I want to say yes to your statement, John, about how complex this issue is becoming. It started in a place, but our society it built from that place, but our society is also evolving, and so should our solutions.
Thank you both. Paul Jansen.
I think I unmuted myself. Did I?
Yes, you did.
Okay. I just wondered, and I know the base metaphor or image that Matthew brought up is about the church order as a building, and so I'm wondering, or Reformed church order as a building in any case. I'm wondering what an order formed more by an image of a tree would look like, of people sitting around a tree and discussing their life together and what needs be. Buildings, Philip Potter reminded us, Philip Potter from the World Council of Churches reminded us that buildings have doors and windows and locks and places that some people can come in and others can't come in and whatnot. And I don't know whether he extended it to the image of the tree, but we don't have an order that's based on Ubuntu, but more on something that's far more Western. And I have no idea what that might look like. But I'm just offering the kind of, wildest conjecture about that. Certainly some kind of order that wouldn't require a significant number of people to do code switching to enter it. So.
And thanks, Paul. You've uncovered my own cultural biases quite well too. As I think about this, as you correctly point out, I get the image of a building from Fahruler's Cathedral of Love. I think the points you bring up are good, and I think the kind of the driving images that we use are an important part of this, because the images that we use help what form the reality. And so so I think it's a good and rich image, I think, to think about.
We are at our time, but we have 3 people in the line, so I'm hoping to invite them in, but because we're going to honor our time as well, ask that nobody else raise their hand or throw in any more questions into the pool. We'll deal with the folks who are here. If anybody has to go ahead and leave, please have a good rest of your day, and I hope to see you back here in 8 weeks when we're talking about the recap from the General Synod that will have happened. Because it hasn't happened yet, I can't tell you exactly who's going to be here or what we're going to talk about, but I have a reasonable inkling that the word restructure may come up. Just a little bit. And so I hope to see you then. But for now, Elvis Alvarez, would you go ahead and unmute and share?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Elvis Alvarez, preaching elder for the Hispanic Reformed Church of Gothenburg, New Jersey. I wanted to comment about what Reverend Norton commented earlier in terms as to when the minorities were becoming part of the RCA, and and he was asking, I guess amongst pastors, they were asking minorities, what is it that you want? And I guess no definite or clear answers were being provided back then. Historically, minorities, history has not been in favor of any minority group, and we can go back to the early settlements of North America: natives, Mexican, Spaniards, blacks, Latinos. So I think as a denomination, we're building a house where we all can feel that we're all just the same, right? And within the past 50 years, the RCA has been building that path where minorities are being counted on. So I think when they started commissioning groups to address these challenges, the Hispanic Council was one of them that was practically put together in the early 70s. And the Hispanic Reformed Church of Gothenburg, it's a product of that, which became a Hispanic Reformed Church within the classes of the Greater Palisades, and still perhaps the only congregation within the classes that conducts services in Spanish. So we're building a house where the future, I think, looks a lot brighter than it did in the past. And to answer that question, whereas, what is it that you want us to do, to have answered that kind of questions back in the early years, I think my opinion to that, it would have been somehow challengeable to provide an answer, because it might have not been the right timing. We just wanted to come in. We wanted to be certain that we were fitting into the right groups and that we were all going to become one family. And knowing like the current situation nowadays, how, for instance, like white evangelicals, patriots, nationalist groups that's emerging nowadays, that's a show that racism's still alive even nowadays. What are the goals that this particular groups are emerging and show are capable of exerting certain powers in the U.S. That's sort of like racist question marks amongst the minorities. So nowadays, of course, because of in the midst of all these changes, I wouldn't be even sharing my opinion right now with anybody in this forum if this forum would have been could have taken place 30, 40 years ago. I probably would have held back. So my answer to that is that I think the timing wasn't proper for anybody to raise their hands and say, listen, now, okay, we're coming into your house of worship. We want to be part of your family, and we want to be taken into consideration that we want to be part of the government bodies of the congregations. So my answer is, I think it was the wrong timing. Thank you.
Earl, Matthew?
There are several things that you said, Elvis, that I really appreciated. You ended with, I think it is the wrong timing. I think when I was sharing about the leadership challenge regarding a theory of change, you do have to know timing. Leaders have to know timing. Some things are premature. There is not the urge to change, the energy to change, nor is there perhaps a shared preferred plan. Jumping the gun in that kind of an environment is something that you may very well lose out on. And that's what you were describing, and I agree with that. Something that you were highlighting about what do you want? That's an interesting question to have been asked that question. What do you want? I guess it depends on when it is asked. if the question is asked after if I'm the sort of the host, or if I'm the lead, if I'm the person being joined with, and I do lots of welcoming things and lots of things that try to, if I figure out, learn about some things that will help you feel more at ease, and I do those things, and you start to feel more at ease, and you start, oh, this is not, and I've taken the initiative to learn those things and engage in those things. And then I were to say, well, what do you want? What's the next things for you? That would feel very differently than to say, I've just come into your space, and it is your space, and I recognize it, and you recognize it. And I say right away to you, so what do you want? That's a very different kind of a greeting. So what do you want means, or how that is interpreted, I think, has a lot to do with how welcoming I'll just use the word host, perhaps, how welcoming the host makes for the environment that someone is coming into. And what that includes is, what did I do to prepare myself to be a host? What did I do to learn more about your ways? What did I do to learn, what's the right way to ask you something? What's the wrong way to ask you something? What kind of cultural cues are important for you? What trigger things are there for you that I need to avoid, innocently avoid? How I am prepared to be host will have a lot to do with when is the right time to ask that question, what do you want?
Okay, and our last bit for today was posted in the Q&A by Jane Barber. She asks, didn't some of the earliest Black churches start out as quote unquote mission churches? And what were the long-term issues around that?
Eh,
Go ahead.
historically, it's hard. It's hard for me to say when I think about some of the early. Well, when I think about some of the Black churches, I think about the churches that kind of became majority Black as the demographics changed. But it's off the top of my head anyway. It's hard for me to say historically. Earl, I'm sure. I wonder if you have some thoughts.
When I think of the word mission, I think mostly of people who immigrated to the U.S. in particular. So I think of Asians and I think of Hispanics. If I'm not mistaken, I think actually the outreach to Asians who were in this country was managed through global missions for us, as opposed to home missions or some group like that. What I'm most aware of with regards to, I did not get born into the RCA. I was a full-fledged adult well into my professional career when I joined the RCA. So what went on before those years, I can't really speak to. But part of what I came to understand, certainly in the New York City area and perhaps in other areas in New Jersey, there was the desire for pastors to be able to lead their own churches. So they were given churches that were in decaying areas, run down areas, the older buildings, and they were given those churches with a blessing to go forward and do the work of the Lord out here. And I think if being part of a mission means you don't get the attention that one who is in the family gets, then I would say they did not get the attention the family got. And a lot of those churches, economically and structurally, are still suffering from those decisions that came back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So I can't speak directly to the language of mission with regards to those churches, but so I would say my imagination is that it would go in this kind of a direction.
Okay. Well, we had one more person who raised a hand, but as I said, I wanted to honor time. So, and I let everybody know. I hope that person will maybe throw something quickly into the chat while I am saying goodbye. But I want to thank Earl, and I want to thank Matthew, and I want to thank all of you who've been here present for this discussion. This is the beginning of a conversation. The church is going to keep having a conversation. We're going to hear from the GSC at General Synod, and then I'm sure there are going to be responses to that, and then there's going to be more conversation, and this will go back and forth not only during this project that the AABC is helping us initiate, but probably for decades and decades more as we keep learning and keep reforming along the way and being reformed by God's Spirit. Thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Take care.